That's when the federal government took on the states, individual states' debts as their own. That's not popular in the South because a lot of the South had in fact paid their states' debts. So now they feel like, well, now we're paying federal taxes to pay other states' debts who, if they were being responsible, they would have paid. Sounds like a pretty modern argument to me, actually. That assumption that the North isn't paying them because of irresponsibility. I don't know enough about the details of what's happening up North, but I'm smart enough to know that maybe they were irresponsible. Maybe their economic situation was different. Who knows? But whatever. Not popular here in the South. So, the heads of the two political parties that have formed get to two men that eventually will absolutely hate each other and already don't get along, meet behind the scenes. And that is Hamilton, who's really pushing that Assumption Act, and Jefferson. And Jefferson agrees to get his supporters in the legislature to adopt the Assumption Act if the government is permanently settled in the South. One of the Articles of the Confederation lays out to create a 10-mile square area that will be the federal government, but it doesn't say where it's going to be or anything like that. So they agree on setting it where it is now. But for some reason I don't quite understand, in the process they decide to go back to Philadelphia for the last few years of Washington's presidency. So they're going to be in Philadelphia for 2 years and then move into the new federal city. So that's while the federal city is being built. I don't know why they felt they had to move out of New York. I'm missing that part of the equation. That is artillery. So suddenly the government under the Constitution is now meeting in Philadelphia. The law was passed pre that, so there's no exemption for the presidency or the Senate. Their slaves are also to be freed if they're there for more than 6 months. And what Washington starts doing is he starts moving his slaves around so that they don't meet the 6 months. I would argue he's still not. I would argue he was in violation of the law because he's not. What you'll read in most sources is that he would send them back to Mount Vernon and replace them, and sometimes he did that. But sometimes he's only sending in other parts of Pennsylvania, and I don't think that would actually disbar the 6 months thing. I think that was a violation of the law. That slave should have still been free by that law. 2 slaves run away because of this. One of them is misinterpreted as running away in Philadelphia, and that is a cook by the name of Hercules. He actually runs away from Mount Vernon, where he's working in the field. So I don't know how he ended up being in the field when he was a cook. My suspicion is that maybe he tried to run when he was up there, and that was a punishment. Because Hercules was walking around. He had freedom of the city of Philadelphia. He was wearing silk suits. I mean, he was in a pretty good position, and suddenly he's working in a field in Mount Vernon. So something happened there, and that's probably why he ran. But Oni Judge runs while she's in Philadelphia. She runs away during dinner when she's a valet. She's not directly responsible for dinner. And everybody else is being distracted. She slips out. Certain free blacks in the area help her. She will eventually end up in New Hampshire, near. I think she's actually in Portsmouth. But she's Washington's wife's slave, and Martha puts Washington in an incredibly awkward situation. And if you're reading the book I think you're in, it doesn't really make that clear enough as it should. Washington is purposely not talking about the issue of slavery. He thinks it's dying anyway. He thinks if you just do nothing, it's going to die. On the other hand, it is becoming a larger and larger issue. So he's afraid that if you do something, you might destroy the Union. So if you're thinking it's going to die anyway, and ending it prematurely might destroy the Union, what's the point of pushing? But he, so as to not annoy either side, he won't talk publicly about his opinions of slavery. So now his wife puts him in this horribly awkward situation because she feels betrayed. Remember I said this like a friendly relationship? But it really is a one-sided. She views personally betrayed because her slave ran off. Because to her it's like, oh, I gave her everything and she's my friend, and no, she's a slave. She left kids behind. So she wants her back. Washington's in an awkward situation where he doesn't want to do anything. He doesn't want to, this is a very modern sounding phrase, but and I don't remember his exact wording, but it's practically the same thing. He doesn't want to reward her for bad behavior. I mean, he gets her to agree to come back with the promise that she'll be freed when he dies. But he's not willing to do that. because he won't promote her bad behavior of leaving in the first place. I would argue her coming back, he could view that was good behavior. He does try to bribe her. He offers to free her children. I'm not sure how he thought he could do that because they weren't his slaves, and they don't end up being, they don't end up being freed until a generation later. One of Martha's granddaughter's ex-husbands ends up freeing them, which is a complicated, unlikely story that couldn't even have happened in Virginia. So that the children will be eventually freed, but not to either of the famous Washingtons. So she runs off. They track her down. Washington's not willing to get her back in a way that'll bring him negative attention, and that's why I completely dispute when that book says relentless. Because relentless, he could have done it, but his reputation is more important. And he doesn't want to be involved in this chasing anything, and it's not because of. Don't get me wrong. It's got nothing to do with virtue. It's public opinion. He doesn't want to be seen. This is an embarrassing situation that his wife is throwing on, and it's his wife, which is why it's a problem. You can't just ignore it. You have to, but eventually they let it go. And the book acts like that's not true, that they never let it go. Eventually Washington has enough and tells his wife, nope, sorry. You got 305, we don't need that one. Their views are different, though, on slavery. Washington, this is a more fun question to actually answer out of character, because I get to talk more in detail about how it's because he wouldn't talk about it. But he goes through a real transition throughout his life. And when he's young, he owns his first slave at 11 when his dad dies. He inherits slaves at 11. By 73, he decides he will no longer buy or sell slaves. During the war, when he takes command, he gets the Congress to prohibit the enlistment of any blacks into the army. He will go back to them and have them change that. By the end of the war, 1/6 of the army were black men. He writes an incredible letter to a black poetry, in fact, a slave. She's not just black; she's an actual slave. A woman named Phyllis Wheatley writes him a poem. He writes a letter in which he apologizes for not having answered it sooner. So he's apologizing to a slave. He's a Virginian slave owner, apologizing to a slave, then stating that he wanted to put it in the newspaper, but he didn't, one, because it isn't his, it's hers, so he doesn't feel like he has the right to do that. So he's recognizing her property ownership of this. When she's a slave, and slaves can't actually have property, they are in fact property. And also because how does a man in a state of humility put a poem in the newspaper that's about him? So he mentions that problem too. During the war, I believe his contact with more anti-slave people, his seeing soldiers defending the country, black soldiers in the war, I think those things take his opinions even further. And he will end up being the only founding father who owned slaves to free all of this. The only one. When he died. Now, I think after having said that, I think it's important to say that at least one founding father wouldn't even hire slaves. And he couldn't free his because he wouldn't own them. He never owned them. And that's John Adams. John Adams would not even rent slaves. It had nothing to do with profit from slave labor. I think that's really worthy of mentioning, even when so many people are doing it. Even up north.
Oh, that's not. what we gotta do once we get these horses all tied up? We gotta take a picture.